All right, before we get started, I just wanted to give a huge shout out to the Washington Commanders and Jane Daniels. I've never seen them get a playoff victory in my entire life. The last time they had a playoff win was back in 2006, and I was still my dad's ball sack. It's been a rough bout, but we have finally made it to a playoff victory. So I had to put the hat back on because we're probably going to lose to the Lions. Wear it while I can. And before we start, you can't see it on this document, but if you open up the learning targets, like the filled out learning targets, the ones with highlighted names are the ones that are on the study guide that Ms. Clark gave us. So if you're in a crunch for time, just study the ones that are highlighted because those are the ones that are going to be questions on the test. And the rest of the stuff you don't really need to worry about as much. And then with the RTs is what we're calling them, the related targets, which is the supplementary thing that Connor Cramer gave us. It lists the study guide questions like, what did the Populist Farmers Association do, or what were the goals of the Populist Farmers Association, and it lists the learning targets for like each term that could be related to that. So each term that could be a possible answer. So if you just want to look over those, that is a great way to study. But if you want the more in-depth to help with the AP and help with any random questions that they might throw on, this whole video is here, of course. And we can just go ahead and get started. All right, let's get into it. And these first 6 terms here are all on the study guide, or all could be potential answers to test questions. So you will want to pay attention for this first little section, starting off with the Farmers Alliance, which was sort of the beginning of unions, that sort of thing, workers' unions. The whole purpose of the Farmers Union was to address the rural poverty and like the cycle of poverty and reliance that farmers in the Midwest that they relied on the Eastern bankers so heavily, so they were trying to break that cycle. They relied on the Eastern railroads so heavily, and they were trying to break that cycle. Independence for farmers, more income equality for all, that sort of gig. And they all came together and created this platform known as the Populists. And the Populists were a people's party. Their strongest support base was in the Midwest, like Kansas, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, where a lot of the farming and producing was taking place. Some of the things that they wanted graduated income tax, labor rights, women's suffrage, public ownership of railroads, which was a huge one. They basically just wanted to fight the political and corporate elites because they were taking advantage of the poor farmers. They also wanted to break free, they wanted low-cost loans to help sort of break free of banks so they could live more independently. This was called the Sub-Treasury Plan. I don't know if that's on here, but that was sort of their plan to break away from these banks. And so the whole point of the Populist Party, their main goal was to make farmers not reliant on these big corporations from the East. And obviously the people in the East did not like that. The Colored Farmers Alliance, so there were still a lot of racial tensions in 1870s, 1890s, that type of thing. So the Colored Farmers Alliance was aimed to support specifically black farmers through collective action, like organized strikes, yada, yada, yada. It's just the Farmers Alliance, but for black people. Mary Elizabeth Lease, she is like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but in the 1890s. She is a Kansas populist lawyer. She was a big orator, and she urged farmers to fight against the Eastern oppression and supported economic reform, women's suffrage, all the good stuff. And then there's James Weaver, who was a populist leader and political candidate in the 1892 presidential election. He was the Populist Party's choice. He carried 5 states and got over 1 million votes. But let's be so for real, he's not winning all that. So he did not win, but he is important for the Populist Party, and it shows sort of their closest grasp to getting to the presidency, but they didn't. Coxey's Army, this is now the section that is not on the study guide, but Coxey's Army was just led by this guy named Jacob Coxey. It was a bunch of unemployed bums, and they went to Washington demanding federal economic relief because there was a severe depression going on, but then the federal troops pulled up and did the thing where they, I don't think they actually shot at them, but they made them disperse. So Coxey's Army just shows the workers rising up to fight. The Pullman strike, this is just like Coxey's Army. Workers in Pullman, Illinois protested wage cuts without rent reductions, and that was supported by the American Railway Union, but the strike disrupted a bunch of railway service stuff, and the federal troops came and crashed the party per usual. So Pullman strike and Coxey's Army are very similar, workers rising up for better working conditions. And then you get Eugene versus Debs. This is a court case of the leader of the American Railway Union, who was one of the key figures in the aforementioned Pullman strike, and he was jailed for defying a court injunction, but then he was advocating for workers' rights, socialism. He basically became a martyr. So Eugene versus Debs, he just think he was the key figure for the Pullman Railway strike. And then there's the election of 1896. The Republican William McKinley, he was supported by all the big tycoon guys, the robber barons, think Carnegie, think Rockefeller. They just basically bought his way to presidency. Some of the things he stood for was keeping the gold standard, high tariffs so everything stays built in America, all those kind of things that the super elites were interested in. Those are probably the only things that you'll really need to know. And then William Jennings Bryan, who was the Democrat candidate, he was super charismatic. He was for like more workers' rights, dispersing the wealth of the elites, which obviously Rockefeller, Carnegie, they all did not want. So they put a lot of money into defeating William Jennings Bryan. It was a pretty close race, but William McKinley did pull it out. Some things like William Jennings Bryan opposed. He opposed the gold standard. He opposed corporate power, and he appeared to like the rural working class Americans. But he did lose to McKinley, so unfortunate. Free silver. This was just the debate of using silver to expand the money supply because, according to the gold standard that was in place at the time, every dollar that was in circulation had to be backed by gold in Fort Knox, and that limited the amount of money that could be in circulation, hence affecting the amount of loans people could take out. So it really hurt the lower classes. But the silver, the free silver controversy was the lower class saying, can we add silver to the gold standard so that there's more money that is allowed in circulation? And the rich people said no, and so it wasn't. The Cross of Gold speech, this is William Jennings Bryan. This is like his pinnacle speech. This is his highlight speech. This is where he criticizes the gold standard into the ground, championed free silver, rallied farmers to fight against the corruption and the oppression of big corporations. And he was, that speech is what made him the Democratic nominee. He didn't win the presidency, but he did win the Democratic nomination. So yeah, that's the beginning. Just think workers fighting against unfair working conditions that are sort of came in from the Gilded Age. Moving way down south to the land of traitors, rattlesnakes and alligators, we have the Redeemers, and this was like a coalition of the Southern elites, and they basically hated everything that the Union brought during Reconstruction, and they tried as much as they could to make life like it was before the Civil War. So this included huge racial segregation, this included slashing of public spending, dismantling reforms, etc., etc. They were basically the bad guys, a little bit of a counterintuitive name, but yeah, Redeemers, bad guys, try to dismantle Reconstruction. New South, this was a term coined by Henry Grady, and he was basically like, oh, look at the North, they have so many factories and it's so beautiful, we can like bring that to the South and it'll be awesome, we'll all be super rich, it'll be great, because the main reason why the South lost the Civil War was because the North industrialized and they were still, like farming with plows, and Henry Grady was like, it's gonna be awesome, and then it just didn't happen. Some places industrialized, like Birmingham a little bit, but pound for pound, the South stayed unindustrialized, and they were economically a lot worse off than the North. Economic opportunities for blacks in the South, yeah, that's about it. There were like none. You can get like low-wage jobs. You get stuck in the sharecropping cycle, like a little bit of domestic work and unskilled labor, but really there was no like job opportunities for blacks in the South. It was really rough in this time period during the Gilded Age, just before, just after. And things like this led to the Kansas Exodus, where 40 to 60,000 African Americans who were able to fled to Kansas to leave the South because the conditions were so bad. Exodus obviously being inspired from the Bible and the story of Moses, except Kansas also sucked, so most of them ended up moving back. Now moving into ways that they prevented black people from voting in the South, the plethora of ways. I got ahead of these people. They were very creative when it came to stopping black people from voting. First, they have the poll tax, and this was basically saying you have to pay a fee to vote, which is like the most unconstitutional thing ever, but whatever. Black people were pound for pound a lot poorer than white people, so it really effectively stopped them from voting because they couldn't pay the tax in order to vote. And then there's the grandfather clause. This is the most genius thing I've ever heard. They said if your grandfather didn't vote, you're not allowed to vote. And if you were if you were a slave and you were just freed, obviously or if your grandfather was a slave, obviously he couldn't vote, which means you can't vote, which means your grandchild can't vote, which means your great-great-grandchild can't vote because you couldn't vote. So it's actually really genius, but once again, just another way to suppress black people from being able to vote. Pretty effective. Literacy test, same thing. They were like, you have to take this state-administered literacy test in order to be able to vote. Otherwise, you were deemed like unintelligent and you couldn't vote. Once again, black people who were not able to access education, this disproportionately affected them. So, hence stopping them from being able to vote. Disenfranchisement, this just talks about the greater, like the things that we have just been talking about. This is poll tax, literacy test, grandfather clause, all of that just put together. When you hear disenfranchisement, it's people in the South trying to stop blacks from voting. So yeah, pretty bad stuff, pretty abusing of black rights, but it's just the truth. It's what was happening. So yeah, moving on. Moving on to everyone's least favorite thing, we have some court cases, starting with the Civil Rights case of 1883. This court case struck down the Civil Rights Act of 1875. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 is what banned racial discrimination in America. They were like, you can't do segregation, basically. And this Civil Rights case of 1883 overturned that, which allowed private facilities, so private companies, to racially segregate. Not public facilities like capitals, buses, etc. Only private companies, but they were allowed. And this just like in the South, racial segregation was everywhere after this. And then Plessy versus Ferguson, which we learned about last unit, and I don't know why it's on here again, but this is where the separate but equal thing comes from, saying that facilities could be separate but equal, but in reality they were just not equal at all. But this was just deeply entrenching sort of racial segregation into American society. It was not very good. Lynching, this is just when a bunch of white people would go and beat up a black dude because he was black, the classic, and they would lynch people every now and then if they didn't like you. So this was just like a sign of white power, white supremacy. So yeah, not great. Ida B. Wells, she was born a slave, became a teacher, journalist, and then led the anti-lynching activist thing. Her newspaper office low-key got destroyed though because the people in the South did not like how she was speaking out against lynching. So then she moved to the North where they couldn't really get her, and then she just spent the rest of her life basically condemning America for failing to uphold the rights of African Americans in the South, which she's not completely wrong for. It wasn't great. But yeah, Ida B. Wells was standing against lynching, standing up for the rights of African Americans in the South. So shout out to her. Moving on to the rewriting of history with the Lost Cause, which just glorified the Confederacy, saying, oh, the Confederacy didn't fight for its slaves, it fought for its Southern heritage and spirit, hoorah, which is totally wrong. The Civil War was fought over slaves, over racial inferiority versus superiority. It was fought over economics. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Religious reunifications between churches. So after the Civil War ended, some churches were able to reunite the North and South that had split during the Civil War, but some churches were not. There were a lot of churches, Baptist churches remain separated to this day. You have Northern Baptist and Southern Baptist. So like some churches would remain separate in order for the Southern Baptist churches and Southern Methodist churches to keep their Southern heritage and whatnot, to keep the South Southern so they didn't have to abide by the church laws of the North or whatnot. So this was just another thing that added to rising tensions between the North and the South in the aftermath of the Civil War. Moving on to new immigration, the chances of you needing to know that are about zero. Moving on to new immigration in the 1890s, as we learned last unit, so I don't know why it's here this unit, all the Central and Southern European people are coming in, and all the Americans are like, no, I don't like that. And they're like, can we make them make a literacy test before they come in? And everyone was like, yes. And then Grover Cleveland was like, no. And he vetoed it. So they all came together and they're like, let's make the Immigration Restriction League, which is exactly what it sounds like. All the people who hated immigrants came together and like, can we stop having immigrants? And Grover Cleveland was like, no. But eventually the Chinese Exclusion Act did get passed because apparently Grover Cleveland doesn't like Chinese people. And we all know what that is from last unit. Chinese people couldn't come in because they were an inferior race and they were, hurting America. And then there was Tate versus Hurley, which wasn't talked about last unit. But this was just the California Supreme Court case that allowed Chinese people into public schools, citing the 14th Amendment. Seems pretty simple. But yeah, that's what the Tate v. Hurley case was. Because, there were families protesting that their daughter was in like a segregated school. It was a whole thing. But yeah, Chinese people can attend normal public school because of Tate versus Hurley. Good. Heading down south to my big bros, the African Americans down in the south, mainly Booker T. Washington, who was the head of the Tuskegee Institute. He advocated for African American progress through vocational education and economic self-reliance, not through political civil rights. He was like, ditch the whole civil rights thing, accept segregation, it's chill, just become educated, become economically self-reliant, and we can live with the segregation. So that was Booker T. Washington's idea, and he proposed that sort of idea at the Atlantic Compromise. That's his famous speech, where he says that whites and blacks can be separate, but that blacks need to educate themselves, and they need to become economically self-reliant. They did both of those things through the Tuskegee Institute, which Booker T. Washington was the head of. If you've heard of the Tuskegee Airmen from World War II, those are, the black pilots, black Air Force Regiment, that stems from this. It was a center for African Americans to come get educated and to become skilled workers, to become more economically self-reliant. And then American Federation of Labor. This is a skilled labor union for, you guessed it, white skilled laborers. And if you weren't that, if you were a black, woman, immigrant, unskilled labor, you were not allowed in the AFL. But it was super exclusive, and it did the normal union things. It emphasized higher wages and whatnot. So AFL was for skilled laborers. Job opportunities for women. All right, wake up. This is where things could actually be on the test. These are study guide areas. These last four right here about women. Job opportunities for women in the last decade of the 19th century. At this point, 5 million women worked for wages, which is ridiculously high compared to what it had been previously. Mainly traditional unskilled roles like producing things like wool, cloths, baskets, etc. But some more and more women were going to college, getting educated, had higher clerical jobs, entered the skilled workforce. So we start to see this, that begins in the end of the 19th century. And these things lead to things like the Women Christian Temperance Union, which was this massive female organization with 150,000 members. And its initial focus was on prohibition and banning alcohol, because everyone knows alcohol is bad. But then it expanded its goals to include women's suffrage, etc., etc. Its leader was, moving on to Carrie Chapman Catt, who is the leader of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which is different from the Women's Christian Temperance Union. It's confusing. But she was just the head of that association, fighting for women's suffrage. They were kind of like a little bit of rivals, but then they eventually merged into the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Oh wait, never mind. The National American Women's Suffrage Association is what combined the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the National American Women's Suffrage Association. I don't know. All you have to know is there are these associations, and they believe that women should vote, and they are very influential in allowing women to vote, which happens further down this list, I believe. So Claire Chapman Catt was the head of the NAWSA, and then there's also the WCT. I don't know, it's so confusing, man. Just one organization, that's enough, you would think. But apparently not, because women want to vote or something. So yeah, that's also, before we move on, I forgot to add, one of the main reason why women said they should be allowed to vote is because then they would counteract the vote of immigrants. So even though it sounds like yay, women can vote, they were like, let us vote so we can counter the vote of the immigrants and of the African Americans, so we can have more white people voting. So under the surface, it was a little sketch, but overall, still. All right, moving on to chapter 17. Most of these terms that I'm about to go over are on the study guide, so I would really pay attention, because you're going to see a lot of this stuff on the test. Starting with factors that encourage the expansionist outlook of America. This ranges from the economic need to absorb industrial production, agricultural growth. There are a lot of immigrants coming in, and people said, hey, we need a new frontier for people to go to, new places to settle people. This is what was driving it. Trade drove it. The desire to be included in these imperial, basically, debates, at the Congress of whatever, where the Berlin Scramble, whatever, you remember world history, where they all go together, they're like, how should we divvy up Africa? America's like, we deserve to be a part of that. We need to become an empire so that we have more of a say in international affairs. Reverend Josiah Strong, this was another reason why they wanted to expand. Social Darwinism. He was like, we are the best. We are Christians and we are white. We need to go share our culture, share our religion with everyone else in the world, because Christianity is the bomb. And just a big social Darwinism guy trying to push Anglo-Saxon values onto inferior races. Our Country, Its Possible Future, Its Present Crisis. This is the book the Reverend Josiah Strong wrote. It was like basically an update on Manifest Destiny, like Manifest Destiny 2.0. It was talking about the economic benefits, the civilizing mission, spreading American goods and values, etc. Alfred Thayer Mann, this is the guy who wrote The Influence of Sea Power Upon History that Miss Cluck yapped about for like 30 minutes. He was just a naval officer who was like, hey, every strong civilization ever has had a navy. Maybe we should get a navy. And everyone was like, all right, sounds pretty good. Which is not true. The Mongols did not have a navy, but it's whatever. But yeah, he argued that American prosperity depended on having a strong navy, which is actually true because we're surrounded by 2 oceans. So, and that had a huge effect of people saying, hey, we should build a big old navy so we can go take everything over. The effect on U.S. policy was political leaders arguing to build things like the Panama Canal, acquire these large naval vessels so we can go take these territories, such as Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Cuba, for the naval advantage. Now moving on to Hawaii. The U.S. interest in Hawaii was, they were like, oh, look at all this place where we can plant sugar. This is awesome. They could also refuel their ships on the way to China, traveling through the Pacific because, you couldn't make it there in one run all the way back then. Issue is there were people living in Hawaii, specifically Queen, Lord have mercy, Liluokalani. The Queen was like, we don't want the Americans living here, and the Americans were like, sorry, loser, and they pulled up anyway. And then Hawaii became a U.S. territory and eventually was annexed as a state. Debate over annexation. President Cleveland was initially against annexation, but then Hawaii was annexed anyway because he was like, yeah, that actually do be looking pretty good. The Yellow Press. This was a press run by super pro-imperialist authors and writers. They were basically just pushing out pro-imperialist propaganda every day, and it's kind of what got the American populace, general populace, riled up to go conquer everything because brouhaha, we're America, we're the best. So the Yellow Press was super influential for imperialist sentiment in America, so really important. Moving into the Spanish-American War, almost all of this stuff is on the study guide, so this is a super important section of the video. Starting with the Cuban Revolt. The Cuban Revolt began because the Spanish were really doing a terrible job of governing the Cubans, and this movement started, the Spanish started governing, the Cubans were trying to fight for their independence, and this is what makes the U.S. kind of look at Cuba as a target because they see it as a place where the people are discontent with the government, and obviously when there's discontent with the government, with a colonial government, that is an opportunity for a new colonial government to go in and impress the people even more. So America was getting hype. The U.S. interest in Cuba, it really wasn't that strategically valuable. It just provided more space, more labor, more farming, etc., 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 more pathway into Latin America, and this thing called jingoism. Basically just like being a war hawk. This was spread through the Yellow Press. It was the idea that America should just go fight people because it's bored. And this idea kind of helped push the American population towards wanting war with Spain because they were like, hey, why not? We got this big old navy. Let's do something with it. So that's jingoism. The Maine explosion. They sent the USS Maine to go just chill in Cuba, just look around, and they accidentally blew themselves up. But the Yellow Press was like, oh, the Spanish did it. The Spanish did not do it, apparently. But everyone in America was like, the Spanish did it, let's go to war. And so they all went to war, and, as the USA does, we smoked that back. The Teller Amendment, this was an important thing that actually didn't end up being important at all. This was a congressional resolution saying, hey, we're going to Cuba for the Cubans, right? We're going to go and we're going to fight the Spanish, and after we're done, we're going to give the Cubans their country, and we're going to leave because we're great guys. That didn't happen, but they were like, that's what we're going to do, and everyone was like, okay. Significance of Dewey's victory at Manila Bay. So they sent Admiral Dewey, commander of a fleet, to the Spanish-owned Philippines. He just went in there and started skra-ta-ta-ta and took over the Philippines. And that was the first American naval battle outside of the Western Hemisphere. And it started to establish American dominance in the Pacific. So yeah, it was pretty hype. Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. this is basically, he called up all his friends and was like, we're going to fight Spaniards. And everyone was like, okay. And so they all pulled up and they swerved, bend that corner. I don't know, that new Jello song is pretty good. And yeah, they went to San Juan Hill and they stormed up a hill and they got to the top and all the black people had already taken the hill for the Americans. But they celebrated the victory anyway. It was publicized, Teddy Roosevelt up at the top, huzzah. They took, I'm pretty sure that was Puerto Rico. Yeah, they took Puerto Rico. So yeah, that was pretty cool. Territorial acquisitions after the Spanish-American War. America takes the Philippines, they take Guam, they take Puerto Rico. Yeah, and they end up establishing bases. Cuba is given independence, but America ends up setting bases like Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. It was granted nominal independence, but then it became under heavy U.S. influence during the Platt Amendment, which is basically, Congress was like, hey, you remember that teller thing that we did earlier? Yeah, what if we just don't do that at all? And basically it says that if America deems that Cuba is unable to govern itself, they can just pull up and just take over, because Cuba doesn't know how to run a government. Only America knows how to do that. And as part of this amendment, they set up Guantanamo Bay, which is an American naval base turned prison in Cuba, and it remains a strategic U.S. base to this day. It just was a sort of a way to insert American influence on Cuba. The open door policy. So this is like Barack Obama's immigration policy, except reverse. Instead of being like, America's like, come on, let everyone in. It's like, China, you let everyone in. But instead of it being just like unskilled immigrants that you're letting in, it's just like white people who want to steal all your stuff. So like, the open door policy was the Americans saying, China, you are going to let us into your country so we can trade with you because we said so. And China was like, China didn't even know that that was going on. But yeah, America pulled up and they went and they traded with the Chinese on the equal level of the British, the Dutch, the Germans, the whole English Anglo orgy that was happening over in China. So yeah, America just wanted a slice of the pie, hence the open door policy. Starts off our Pacific trade and we make some bank. So yeah, there we go. Moving on to McKinley. Moving on to Emilio Aguinaldo. He was the leader of the Filipino independence movement trying to resist American occupation. They fought like a solid 10-decade-long struggle. But yeah, at the end of the day, you're fighting America. What can you do other than get water cured, which is basically where they would like waterboard you and like almost drown you as a torture method. So if you were a Filipino resistance person, the Americans would do this to you. Not our brightest moment, but you know, you got to do what you got to do to Christianize the Filipinos who are already Roman Catholic. Yeah, that was McKinley's justification for annexation, was like, we need to uplift, civilize, and Christianize. But yeah, they're already Roman Catholic, and the Spanish had already been there for a while, so it was pretty chill over there. But yeah, really they just wanted it for trade, opening up the southern Asian trade like India and the Dutch East Indies. So yeah, really just selfish, but brutal tactics used to subdue the Filipinos. So not our brightest moment, but we did what we had to do. These next few things are not on the study guide until we get to chapter 18, so just put me in 2x speed for a second, and I'm just going to go through these pretty fast. So making an appearance for the third unit in a row, you really got to applaud it. You know, that's just dedication right there. Love of the game. The white man's burden is back again, better than ever. It's still the same exact thing of white people thinking it is their job to civilize more inferior races, more inferior cultures, to bring them up to the level of civilization of whites. We all know what that is. Debate over imperialism. So the arguments for imperialism was that it would help with trade a lot. It would help grow America's power internationally. It was seen as a place for people to go to reopen the frontier, like the Frederick Jackson Turner idea. So those are all reasons for. Arguments against was that it was totally incompatible with the ideas of the Declaration of Independence and self-government, and that it was like breaking every constitutional law that we have and being oppressive. Some people were also like, they don't want to live in the same nation as people who aren't white. They don't want to live in the same nation as people from Puerto Rico or the Philippines, et cetera, et cetera. So, and they would also say it costs a lot of money to maintain and support these states that brought in less revenue than America. So that was the for and against. William Jennings Bryan was against, you won't need to know any people specifically. Empire of Liberty, big emphasis on the quotation marks. The Empire of Liberty was supposedly the idea that wherever America went, liberty would follow. Like, we would grant rights to all the places we went, and they would become utopias like America. And obviously, that did not happen. It was just the idea. The Foraker Act of 1900. This listed Puerto Rico as insular territory, meaning that it was not a state. It was never going to be a state. And its residences were Puerto Rican citizens, not U.S. citizens, and it denied them full rights as well as political representation. And then there were the insular cases of 1901. They were trying to combat the Foraker Act. They failed. The U.S. Supreme Court determined that the U.S. Constitution did not fully apply to newly acquired territories like Puerto Rico and the Philippines, etc. And so those places, or I guess Philippines isn't a part of America, but Puerto Rico, Guam, etc. still don't have representation in Congress today. The Anti-Imperialist League, that's exactly what it sounds like. A bunch of anti-imperialist businesses, people, etc. all got together and they were like, hey, we don't like that. And then The New Empire by Brooks Adams. So this was a book written in 1902 that predicted, due to the industrialized nature of the United States of America and its expansionist tendencies, that America would surpass all other empires in the world. And I just got to say, what a prediction. That's got to be up there. All-time prediction. That's just phenomenal stuff. I can't even lie. So that did in fact come to fruition. We are the greatest empire probably ever. So real shout out to Brooks Adams with some great foresight right there. So yeah, that is this short little section. All right, this next little section is all on the study guide. So at least put me in like 1.25 speed for this section. Starting with the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. This was a big fire that happened in a shirt manufacturing factory thing. And the fire started and all the people couldn't get out because the doors were locked, so they started jumping out windows and a bunch of people died. It was all because the workplace was not very safe. And a lot of people died, 146 people died. And this caused the public to look and say, hey, maybe we should have some regulation, some government regulations on business to keep workers more safe. So all of the safety practices that we see today in business all stem from the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. The reason why at school the doors fling out into the hallways and just nail random freshmen instead of opening inwards like everyone thinks would be like smart, it's because of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, and that it's actually safer for them to like fling out and hit random people than it is to come in. Progressivism, this is just a broad political idea of working to progress. That's basically what it is. Specifically in America, it was trying to address mainly wealth inequality and political inequality. It was trying to expand democracy, like political intervention, to want everyone to exercise their right to vote. Oh, Feinstein texted. Yeah. Wants to expand political engagement, get everyone voting, and wants to expand or decrease wealth inequality, sort of distribute wealth, bring more workers' rights, keep workplaces safer, sort of in line with modern day Democrats. That's how you can think of the progressives. The muckrockers. Okay, so these are the investigative journalists who would go in and see all the corruption, all the crap that's going on, and they would expose it through their novels. And all of these you need to know. I don't know if it'll be like a matching thing or what, but pay attention because these will most definitely be on the test in some way, shape, or form. First, Shame of the Cities by Lincoln Steffens. This exposed the political corruption inside American cities, particularly through like bribery, mismanagement, political entities. This is a lot like Boss Tweed and the Tammany Hall. This is exposing that kind of corruption. And then there's History of Standard Oil by Ida Tarbell, which is just exposing the monopolistic like practices of John D. Rockefeller. And this novel led to a lot of outcry to fight trust. It led to a lot of antitrust movement. People did not like the monopolies after this book. How the Other Half Lives by Jacob Riis. This is super focused on immigrants and the poor living conditions of like the super poor and the impoverished in New York City. He used photography for this. That was his main medium, sort of elevated photography in journalism, so that is important. And then Upton Sinclair, The Jungle, which is probably the most famous, talking about the meat packing and how disgusting it was. And Teddy Roosevelt read that book and was like, hell nah, not in my America. And so we get like the Pure Food and Drug Act, the Meat Inspection Act, etc. So these books directly lead to change in America, and that's what you have to know. For the progressives, they progress, whatever. And then, there's Theodore Dreiser's Sister Carrie. No one cares about this one. It's not even on the study guide. It talks about like urban life and like social consequences and like moral dilemmas. So you get like poor people dying in slums, and then it's like, oh, young women's social dilemmas in Chicago. Yeah, nobody really cares about that one. Ellis Island, that is, once again, I think this might also be a third consecutive unit really, really dedicated love of the game. GOAT conversation, White Man's Burden versus Ellis Island's about to go crazy. But yeah, it's just that island in the New York Harbor where all the immigrants would pull up. And if you were considered undesirable, they'd just deport you, which would kind of suck. And then that's where they would all come through. So that's what Ellis Island is. Angel Island is just like Ellis Island, but on the west coast. It's where all the Asian immigrants, specifically the Chinese, would come. It's where they would get processed. It was like the Ellis Island, but on the west. If they ask a question about Ellis Island in this unit, just chalk everything. I don't even know at this point. But yeah, all right, moving on to some more things that are not on the study guide, starting with what did most Americans spend their money on at the turn of the century? So when looking at history at a broader context, you have to realize that for most of history, most people spent most of their money on food. And because food is what you need to stay alive. But now, due to the Industrial Revolution, at the turn of the century, people they have enough money, and food is in such rich supply. Like, you don't even think about, like, buying food is, like, hardly an expense nowadays. But you have all this leftover money that you can use to buy goods, buy appliances. You're buying, like, dishwashers, televisions, sewing machines, vacuum cleaners. You could buy dildos. I actually don't know if they had dildos then. Let's see. What's the history of dildos? Go ask Alice. 20! Go! Never mind. You could certainly buy dildos. They were around. But yeah, consumerism starts in the 20th century due to the Industrial Revolution. Nickelodeons, this was like affordable movie theaters. Nickelodeon today, but they were like these affordable movie theaters. It was like 5 cents for admission, but they would make films accessible to working class families, and by 1910 about 25 million people attended these theaters weekly. So Nickelodeons is what made movies popular. This is more consumerism. Assembly line, this is Fordism. If you remember from Human Geography, Fordism and Made to Order, whatever the Japanese one was called. But yeah, the assembly line is like, they move on the assembly line, you do one thing, and it allows you to produce a lot of something at a time. So you can produce a gazillion vacuum cleaners, a gazillion dildos, a gazillion cars if you're Ford. You get to build whatever you want. So that's what Fordism is. It's the assembly line process, and that was what helped mainstream all of these commercial goods to the American public. The American standard of living. So when you think of the standard of living, it's like us in America, we live really, really amazing lives, especially compared to some of those around the world who are less fortunate. And the American standard of living concept comes from this commercialism at the start of the 20th century, of people buying all of these things, and it really improves their standard of living. People are given livable wages so they can pay for necessities and have a little bit of money left over for consumerism, etc., etc. So America's standard of living starts because of all of these commercialist things. Scientific management by Frederick W. Taylor. So this is like a theory that aim to improve work efficiency by finding like the best way to complete tasks. So it's like if it boosted productivity, but it's like, all right, it's most efficient for you to stand here in this assembly line and just like put on a tire for like 8 hours a day. And that's not fun, and no one likes putting on a tire for 8 hours a day, but it is the most efficient thing for you to have one job that you do on your assembly line. It produces the most output. So that was like the scientific management thing, came up by Frederick W. Taylor. Once again, plays into the whole Fordist thing. So yeah, that was what was popping. Hey, bro. All right, we're going to go super fast. None of this stuff is on the study guide, so I'll go. Louis D. Brandeis. He was appointed to the Supreme Court, and he was pro-union. That's all you need to know. Supreme Court, pro-union, pro-political liberties, self-governance, all that stuff. Socialist Party. The socialists created a party for socialism. They never really won anything, but they existed. It was growing in influence in America at this time due to the big disparity in wealth. Eugene V. Debs. I lied to you. Last time, Eugene V. Debs is on here twice, just so I can correct my mistake, I guess. Eugene V. Debs is not a court case. It's a person. Why would you put their middle initial? It doesn't make any sense. It's so annoying. Eugene v. Debs is not a court case that it made no sense earlier. I was like, what is this? No, Eugene Debs is a person. So this person was Eugene Debs. There's no V in their name. We're getting rid of that because it's terrible. So Eugene v. Debs was just a socialist. They pushed for socialism, advocating for economic freedom from the robber barons who were making everything terrible. Pro-democratic government control of the economy, basically meaning government-mandated economy led by the government, etc., etc. Classic socialism. Collective bargaining. This is basically just the idea behind unions, saying if we all come together, we have a lot more power in saying raise wages or all of us won't work. That's collective bargaining. The Industrial Workers of the World, or the IWW. If you recall the AFL, that was like only for white skilled laborers. And then everyone else was like, okay, now what do we do? So they joined the IWW. This basically took all the rejects that the AFL didn't want, which was basically everybody. Government response to strikes. Most of the time, they would send in the military and disband the strikes. But, sometimes Teddy Roosevelt would actually side with the populace, but for the most part, the government is on the side of the employers and against the strikers, which gives them a pretty bad rep. Mother Jones, this is one of the most prominent labor organizers, champion of union rights, of labor rights. She was actually jailed at the age of 83 for supporting striking workers, and then she became a martyr and a symbol of how people should rise up against the government. Hoorah, rah. All right, we're going to keep going. Moving on, more things on the study guide. Pay attention. Starting with new feminism. They're done with old feminism. New feminism. And new feminism is all about the woman's body, the right for like sexual contraceptives or whatnot. Birth control doesn't come out for a little while, but this is like all about contraceptives, woman's control over one body, which we still see today with like the whole abortion thing. That is new feminism. It's not so, it's like focused on, it goes beyond suffrage. It's saying voting isn't enough. We also want these additional rights, like the whole abortion thing, or I guess they didn't have abortion then, but like contraceptives and whatnot, birth control in some sense. And if that's new feminism, I don't even know what feminism today is. That's like futuristic feminism. I don't know. We low-key went off the rails. Margaret Sanger, she was a leading figure in the birth control movement, advocated for women's rights. She made a list of a bunch of ways to stop having a kid if you didn't want one. She was thrown in jail because people were like, what you talking about, fool? Why don't you want a kid? So yeah, she was thrown in jail, but she kind of paved the way for reproductive rights for women. Birth control movement. This aimed to make contraceptives accessible to all women so that they didn't have to have babies if they didn't want to. It was led by Sanger, and it was legally harassed the whole time. Society of American Indians. This is exactly what it sounds like. It was established in 1911 and aimed to address the Native American issues. Leaders like Carlos Montezuma advocated for self-determination and full citizenship inside of America, which challenged the federal control over the indigenous peoples. Moving on. But yeah, that's not important. You won't need to know that. Moving on to the political goals of the progressives. I low-key already talked about this, and hopefully you can tell me what the political goals of the progressives are so you can do well on your test. But once again, they are a socially conscious government that protects its citizens and promotes democracy, social equality, reducing wealth inequality, expanding democracy, engagement for all people, etc., 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 public welfare, whatever. State and local progressive reforms. This and the voting progress reforms are like the same thing with the whole referendum, whatever. Initiative, referendum, recall. So I'm going to kind of lump them together. But at the state and local levels, this thing called the initiative, referendum, and recall was instituted, and this is super important. It gave citizens more direct control over laws and officials. Initiative. This allows citizens to propose new laws. You can go to the Westlake Municipal City office or whatever and say, hey, I think we should do this. And if it gets a certain number, if the petition gets a certain number of signatures, they have to listen to it. They have to hear it. The referendum enables voters to approve or reject law. So if your petition gets enough votes, it can be put on the ballot in the referendum, and people will vote on it, yay or nay. Recall. This gives voters the power to remove officials at the state and local level from office. We can't do a recall on a president, but you could do like a recall for, I think, your mayor or your sheriff if they are abusing their power, etc. The Public Utilities Act. So this was passed in California under Hiram Johnson, and this was aimed to regulate monopolies like railroads, utilities, etc., ensuring that they were more accountable and accessible to people in the public. Robert LaFollette, whatever, he was Wisconsin's progressive governor. In fact, if you look at the 1924 presidential election, shout out Calvin Coolidge, it's all red, all for Cool Cal. The South is Democrat, and then it's just Wisconsin sitting in the sea of red, and the Progressive Party won that state. They're super progressive. Robert La Follette is their governor. He introduced the Wisconsin idea, which was like direct primaries, tax reform, state regulation, just a bunch of progressive ideals. So Robert La Follette, Wisconsin, progressive. 17th Amendment. This was ratified in 1913 and allowed for the direct election of U.S. senators, meaning that the majority leader in the Senate would not choose, would not appoint senators, rather the people would vote on them. So yeah, that's what the 17th Amendment is. We are moving through. Let's just go as fast as we can because this is terrible. All right, more things on the study guide, starting with Jane Addams, who was a super important progressive era reformer in Chicago who founded the Whole House, which is right below it. She rejected traditional women values or whatever. And she created the Whole House, which is the important thing, which is super important for immigrants, poor families. It was basically a refugee house where people could come in with better sanitation, food, whatever. It fought for better worker rights, etc. Whole House was like a shining beacon of progressive reform. Florence Kelley, she led the National Consumers League. Maybe it's a dude, I don't even know. No, it is a girl. Florence Kelley led the National Consumers League, and she was telling the consumers, the people who are buying the things, saying, hey, you should fight for better worker rights so that the things that you buy will be ethically purchased. It starts this idea of ethical consumption of I don't want to buy that if the people who made it were working under terrible conditions, which we don't care about anymore because we buy all our stuff from kids in China. But that was what the National Consumers League was, linking ethical consumption to social justice or whatever. Women's suffrage in the West. So women's suffrage started in the West, in Wyoming, in Colorado, in Utah. These states granted women the right to vote first. Eventually, it expanded to 1913 in Illinois. Illinois gave women the right to vote in presidential elections, and the movement continued to push eastward until it was granted everywhere in the 20th Amendment, or 19th, or I think it was the 20th. No, actually it was the 19th, I'm almost certain. It happened in 1920, it's very confusing. Maternalist reform. These reforms supported women and children, but often excluded single mothers, black women. But basically, they gave women more PTO for having kids, etc., etc. It gave mothers pensions, so that was super important. Maternalist reform, that's just kind of going on. Mueller versus Oregon. And this upheld limits on women's working hours, saying women cannot work more than this amount of hours a week. So it was a breach of the old liberty of contract where people were allowed to decide their own contracts for working. And it was the government saying women can only work this long, and it reinforced women as weaker dependent because they were not meant to be working as long, and hence they couldn't by the law. All right, we just have this last little section, then we'll be done. I'll try to get done in 12 minutes so that we stay under an hour, but who knows. Starting with Teddy Roosevelt. Everyone loves Teddy, popular guy. So shout out Teddy Roosevelt. He's a goat. Starting with the Square Deal, and this is Roosevelt's domestic program focused on confronting the issues created by monopolies. He would try to look at the good monopolies and the bad monopolies and get rid of the bad monopolies. So that's what the Square Deal was. The Northern Securities Company versus the United States. J.P. Morgan owned the Northern Securities Company. If you were watching that video in class, they showed this in the video. But J.P. Morgan owns this, but they violated the Sherman Antitrust Act, and Teddy Roosevelt was like, that is a bad trust. So he took them to court, and in the Supreme Court, they ruled that J.P. Morgan had to dissolve the Northern Securities Company, and so that was a huge win for the antitrusters. And then we have the anthracite coal strike. This was this big coal strike. It was coming right before winter, and Roosevelt did what no other president had ever done before and stepped in and mediated a resolution to the coal strike. And so that set a precedent that all presidents in the future need to step in and mediate strikes. Made him super popular. Everyone loved him. The Hepburn Act. So this just strengthened the International Commerce Commission. If you remember that, it was like the railroad, the people who regulated the railroads. The Hepburn Act gave them more power, more regulation of the railroads. That was it. The Pure Food and Drug Act / Meat Inspection Act, whatever thing. This came after Teddy Roosevelt read The Jungle by Upton Sinclair and realized that, we're eating a bunch of thumbs basically. And so he created all these acts that made sure it increased the safety with which food was produced so that the food that people ate was healthy to a degree. So that was more progressive progress, more acts. Conservation movement, creation of national parks. Teddy Roosevelt did that. John Muir, he was a naturalist. He was a founder of the Sierra Club. But he advocated for protecting forests from exploitation in humans, and he viewed nature as like sacred and a source of spiritual renewal. So obviously Roosevelt loved that. And then there was Gifford Pincott, I don't even know how to say that, but he promoted the sustainable use of resources, believing conservation, like basically economic development and conservation of nature could exist at the same time. And that's the difference between the preservationists and the conservationists. The preservationists believe that humans should not interact with nature at all. Economic development and nature cannot coexist at the same time, and that people needed to choose nature. Stop economic development, stop doing anything at all in the forest, whatnot. Conservationists were similar, but they had one stark difference, and it was that they believed that economic development of humans and the conservation of nature could happen at the same time. And we see conservationist efforts take place through the national parks, where humans are allowed, like economic development is allowed, but parts of nature are still preserved. So that is the conservationist effort. And then there's Willie Howard Taft. I had to do a presentation about Taft in like the first grade, I think, and the only thing I remember was that he was so fat they needed a crane to get him out of the bathtub, which apparently isn't true, which is kind of sad because it's kind of funny that he was that fat. But yeah, breakup of Standard Oil Company. Taft really hated these guys for some reason, and he aggressively pursued antitrust policies, and the Supreme Court ruled that the Standard Oil must be broken up under the Sherman Antitrust Act. So it applied the rule of reason, distinguishing between the good and the bad trust, saying that Standard Oil was a bad trust, so they got the boot. The Ballinger-Pincoat controversy. So this is the Secretary of the Interior, Richard Ballinger. He reversed Roosevelt's errors. He reversed the conservation policy set in place by Teddy Roosevelt. And he opened a bunch of conserved land for development. And Gifford Pincott, the previously mentioned guy, publicly opposed this decision, like, what are you doing, you bum? Taft sided with Ballinger, though, and was like, Pincott, get out, you got fired. And that sort of deepened the rift between Taft and the progressives. And Teddy Roosevelt really did not like that. And it's actually one of the reasons why Teddy Roosevelt chose to run again in 1912, after Taft had already been president and he had served 2 full terms. So that was the Ballinger-Pincott controversy. Ballinger wins, takes a lot of federally protected land to try to build more things, and all the progressives are like, no way, bro. All right, last bit. We're so close. Starting with the election of 1912. And there's something you got to know about the election of 1912. This is what I don't like about Teddy Roosevelt. He low-key sold the bag. Woodrow Wilson is, in my opinion, like, he's just a terrible president. All these things seem pretty cool, but Woodrow Wilson is the worst. He's a raging racist, and he's basically just the worst. But William Howard Taft won the Republican primary and was like, I'm going to run for president as the Republican nominee. And Teddy Roosevelt was like, well, I actually want to be the president again. And so he ran as an independent, which split the Republican Party between William Taft and Teddy Roosevelt. They each got like, 30% of the vote, which allowed for Woodrow Wilson to win. And man, everyone hates Woodrow Wilson. So yeah, that kind of sucks. But it was New Freedom, which was Woodrow Wilson, versus New Nationalism, which was Theodore Roosevelt. New Freedom was aimed to reinvigorate like democracy by breaking up monopolies and reducing the power of the federal government. Protecting workers, promoting small business, but limiting the power of the federal government. New Nationalism, which is what Theodore Roosevelt pushed for, was the aggressive attack of big corporations, big monopolies, big trusts, but also wanted a larger, increased government to sort of regulate all of these things. Also women's suffrage, social insurance, etc., etc., etc. So that's the difference, New Freedom versus New Nationalism. And then Woodrow Wilson, and all of these things are on the study guide, so you need to know all of these acts. I know it's annoying, but starting with the Underwood Tariff in 1913. So this significantly reduced tariffs and introduced this like graduated income tax. Man, everyone hates income tax. It's the worst. To help compensate for the lost revenue from the tariffs. So when Trump says that he wants to like make 20% tariffs on everything and then like hire for China and whatnot, and he refers to a time in American history where all of the government's income for the most part was off of tariffs. And this is what he's referring to. Up until 1913, there was no federal income tax. America made all of their money off of tariffs for the most part. And so that's what Trump was talking about, just so you know. And then the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914, this strengthened the antitrust laws. It exempted labor unions from prosecution. So antitrust, whatever, more. Woodrow Wilson hates the trust, Woodrow Wilson hates the trust. Then the Keating-Owens Act, they were like, hey, maybe children shouldn't be working in the mines. We're going to ban child labor. Wrong, said the Supreme Court, who overturned the Keating-Owens Act. allowing children to work. They were like, we need them kids working. We need to produce good, hardworking men, and it starts with child labor. So it stopped child labor, but then the Supreme Court overturned it. The Adamson Act, this established an 8-hour workday for railroad workers. This just showed like growing federal support for unions and labor rights and whatnot. Warehouse Act, this helped farmers a lot. It allowed farmers to access credit if they stored their crops in federally licensed warehouses. Then there was the Federal Reserve Act of 1903, which once again helped farmers and basically everybody. Created the Federal Reserve System, stabilized the currency, stabilized the banks, controlled interest rates. And then there was the Federal Trade Commission Act of 19. It's all the worst. I know, it's terrible. The FTC, it was made to prevent unfair business practices like monopolies, price fixing, price gouging, etc. So all of these things, these are all acts passed by Woodrow Wilson. And these are all targeting monopolies to help workers. If you see any of these, help workers attack monopolies. Progressive amendments. 16th Amendment, income tax. Man, everybody hates income tax. I don't even pay income tax, and I still hate income tax. But this is what enabled the government to raise funds for more agencies, whatnot. 16th Amendment is income tax. 17th Amendment is the senators being voted by the public, as aforementioned. Reduced corruption, increased democratic accountability, etc. 18th Amendment, prohibition. Man, everybody hates prohibition. Everyone knows how much I love alcohol. Just love a good old IPA on draft, if you know what I mean. But yeah, 18th Amendment prohibited alcohol. Obviously, that's not around anymore. People drink beer. But apparently they had a little bit of an alcohol problem back then. And so this was the beginning of prohibition. And the 19th Amendment, okay, I was right. It was the 19th. It is women's suffrage. You made it. Women can finally vote. That means that at the bottom of each of these videos, no longer will you see some random woman who tried to get women's suffrage but failed. We have finally made it. This might be the most dedication to the game. This might be the GOAT conversation of all the women throughout every unit who asked for the right to vote. Time after time again, rejected. Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I don't even remember any of the other ones. All of them rejected. Susan B. Anthony, rejected. They finally made it. Women can finally vote. And I think I made it below an hour. 5 minutes for this section. I think we did it, guys. But yeah, this unit sucks. It's the worst. It's terrible. If you cheat, I don't blame you, per usual. But yeah. Practice test below, practice test key, all the stuff. The related targets if you just want to do targeted studying, which I would probably recommend. And yeah, we did it. Good luck, guys. You got this. I'm glad it's over.